The morning they came to throw 77-year-old Eleanor Whitaker out of her home, she was standing at her husband's grave holding a bouquet of supermarket carnations she could barely afford, completely unaware that buried beneath a pile of dusty fishing equipment back at the house was a faded property deed that would change everything anyone thought they knew about her late husband, about the river town they had lived in for more than 50 years, and about why powerful men suddenly seemed desperate to see an old widow disappear quietly before she discovered what she truly owned. 7 days earlier, Eleanor still believed her life, though difficult, was at least stable in the quiet, predictable way old age sometimes becomes after decades of routine. Every morning she woke before sunrise, brewed weak coffee because the stronger kind upset Ed's heart medication, and sat beside the kitchen window watching mist rise off Blackwater River while her husband coughed softly in the next room, pretending not to be in pain. Their small riverside house had never been fancy. The porch sagged slightly toward the road, the wallpaper in the hallway had peeled near the ceiling years ago, and half the kitchen drawers stuck whenever humidity rolled in from the water. But to Eleanor it was the most important place on earth because every inch of it contained a memory. The scratches near the pantry door came from their son Daniel racing toy trucks through the house in 1972. The faded burn mark on the counter came from the Thanksgiving turkey Ed accidentally dropped while trying to impress her mother. The creaking floorboard outside the bedroom had once annoyed her, but after 52 years of marriage, even that sound became comforting because it meant Ed was still awake, still moving, still there. Then came the hospital visit that changed everything. Eleanor remembered every detail afterward with painful clarity. The smell of antiseptic, the flickering fluorescent lights, the sound of rain tapping against the windows while a tired doctor with exhausted eyes explained that Ed's heart was failing faster than expected. "We'll keep him comfortable," the doctor said carefully, avoiding the truth because doctors often learned that old people understood death perfectly well without hearing the exact words aloud. Eleanor sat beside Ed's bed for 3 straight nights holding his hand while machines hummed softly around them. Sometimes he slept. Sometimes he stared out the window toward the distant river beyond town as if trying to memorize it one last time. And once, very late at night, while thunder rolled outside, he squeezed her hand weakly and whispered something she did not understand then. "Don't let them take the river." Eleanor leaned closer, thinking medication had confused him. "What river, honey?" she asked softly. But it only closed his eyes again, too exhausted to explain. He died 2 mornings later, just before dawn with Eleanor's hand still wrapped around his. The funeral was held on a gray Friday beneath low storm clouds that made the cemetery look almost colorless. Half the town attended because the Whitakers had spent decades running the old bait and tackle shop near the bridge before big chain stores drove small businesses out one by one. Men who had fished with Ed for 40 years stood silently near the back. Women Eleanor had known since high school hugged her too tightly and spoke in whispers that blended together until none of the words meant anything anymore. Daniel flew in from Seattle wearing an expensive black coat and checking his phone every few minutes when he thought nobody noticed. His wife stayed home with the children. Eleanor told herself not to feel hurt by that. People had busy lives now. The world moved faster than it used to. After the burial, everyone slowly disappeared back into their own routines while Eleanor remained beside the grave staring at the wet soil covering the man she had loved since she was 19 years old. That should have been the hardest part of the week. Losing him should have been the worst thing that happened. But grief, Eleanor would later learn, sometimes arrives holding hands with cruelty. 3 days after the funeral, there was a knock at the front door. Eleanor expected another casserole from a neighbor or perhaps flowers from church friends. Instead, she found a thin man in a gray overcoat carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. He introduced himself politely as a representative from the bank. Even years later, Eleanor would remember how strangely calm his voice sounded while dismantling her entire life sentence by sentence. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began carefully, "I'm afraid there are unresolved issues regarding the refinancing agreement on this property." Eleanor blinked in confusion because Ed handled most of the financial paperwork after his cancer treatments began years earlier. "There must be some mistake," she said quietly. The man shifted uncomfortably before opening the folder. "No mistake. Missed payments. Accumulated debt. Final notices previously mailed. Foreclosure proceedings already approved." Eleanor felt cold all over despite the summer heat pressing against the windows. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Ed would have told me." But deep down she already understood exactly why he had not. Pride, shame, fear. Her husband had spent the final months of his life trying desperately to protect her from a disaster he knew he could no longer stop. "You have 14 days to vacate the property," the banker continued gently, almost apologetically, as though kindness could soften the meaning of those words. 14 days to leave the only home she had known for half a century. 14 days to pack away an entire marriage into cardboard boxes. After he left, Eleanor sat motionless at the kitchen table until darkness filled the room around her. She did not cry immediately. The tears came later while wrapping dishes in newspaper and realizing she could remember exactly where each plate had been purchased decades earlier. She cried while folding Ed's flannel shirts, even though they still smelled faintly like him. She cried while standing in Daniel's empty childhood bedroom, staring at old baseball trophies covered in dust. Her son called every evening, insisting she move to Seattle with him temporarily. But Eleanor heard hesitation beneath the generosity, the careful politeness of a family trying to do the right thing without truly wanting their lives disrupted. So she thanked him and said she would figure something out. By the final night inside the house, nearly everything was packed except for a few items in the garage that Eleanor lacked the strength to sort through. Rain hammered the roof while she wandered among old shelves crowded with fishing reels, tackle boxes, rusted tools, and river junk Ed had refused to throw away for decades. "You kept every useless thing imaginable," she muttered bitterly, wiping tears from her face. Then, while lifting an old green tackle box onto the workbench, she heard something slide loose beneath it. An envelope, yellowed with age. Her name written across the front in Ed's unmistakable handwriting. Eleanor froze. Slowly, trembling now, she opened it. Inside rested a folded deed stamped with county seals she did not recognize, and a single handwritten sentence that made her heart begin pounding so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "You still have one thing left they can't take." The first thing Eleanor Whitaker noticed about the boathouse was that it looked as though the river itself had been slowly trying to swallow it for years, pulling it inch by inch toward the dark water until the entire structure leaned at an angle that made her wonder whether one strong storm might finally finish the job. The second thing she noticed was the silence. Not ordinary silence either, but the deep, isolated kind that exists only far from towns and highways, where wind through trees and slow-moving water become the loudest sounds in the world. She sat behind the wheel of her aging station wagon for nearly 5 minutes after arriving, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the property her husband had secretly protected while the rest of their life collapsed around them. This was what it had left her. Not money, not security, a dying shack beside a forgotten river. After losing the house, Eleanor had driven aimlessly for most of the morning with her belongings packed tightly into the back of the car. 2 suitcases, several boxes of clothes and photographs, a coffee tin filled with important documents, and the small wooden urn containing Ed's ashes resting carefully on the passenger seat beside her like he was still accompanying her somewhere. She had nowhere else to go. Daniel called twice during the drive from Seattle, his voice strained with guilt and frustration when she refused to tell him exactly where she was headed. "Mom, please don't do this," he said during the second call. "Just come stay with us until we figure something out." Eleanor stared through the windshield at endless rain and wet highway lines blurring beneath gray skies. "I already raised my family, Daniel," she answered quietly. "I'm too old to become somebody's responsibility." He tried arguing, but she ended the call before he could continue because deep down she knew the truth neither of them wanted to say aloud. His life no longer had space for her grief inside it. By late afternoon, she reached Blackwater River. The road narrowed into cracked pavement, then gravel, then mud cutting through dense trees heavy with summer rain. Eleanor remembered coming here once in the early 1980s with Ed and Daniel for a fishing trip, though even then the place had looked abandoned. Back then the river still carried logging barges occasionally, and fishermen crowded the docks during salmon season. But over the years the river economy died slowly like everything else in small American towns. Stores closed. Families moved away. Buildings rotted. Nature reclaimed what people stopped using. When Eleanor finally stepped out of the car, Damp wind rushed off the river carrying the smell of wet cedar and mud. The boathouse stood at the end of a crooked dock barely attached to shore anymore. Its faded blue paint had almost completely peeled away, exposing gray weather-beaten wood underneath. One side of the roof sagged badly. Several windows were cracked. Weeds pushed through the warped planks near the entrance. "Dear God, Ed," Eleanor whispered under her breath, exhausted beyond tears now. Still, she forced herself forward, carrying the envelope with the deed clutched tightly in one hand. The old padlock opened with surprising ease, as though someone had used it recently, and the heavy wooden door groaned loudly when she pushed it inward. Dust floated through narrow shafts of evening light cutting across the interior. At first glance, the place appeared exactly how she expected. Cluttered, neglected, forgotten. Fishing nets hung from hooks along the walls beside rusted lanterns and old life jackets stiff with age. Shelves overflowed with river junk collected over generations. Coffee cans filled with nails, broken reels, cracked buoys, moldy maps, tools nobody used anymore. Near the far wall sat a tiny cot covered with folded blankets. A cast iron wood stove occupied one corner beside a stack of chopped firewood. Eleanor moved slowly through the room, overwhelmed by the strange feeling that she had stepped backward through time, into some hidden fragment of Ed's life she never truly knew existed. Then she stopped suddenly. The stove was warm. Not hot, but definitely warm. Fresh ashes rested inside beneath partially burned wood. Somebody had been there recently. Eleanor's chest tightened instantly. "Hello," she called uncertainly into the empty structure. Only rain answered from outside. Fear crept quietly into her exhaustion then. She locked the door behind herself and spent the next hour unpacking a few belongings while daylight faded beyond the river. She told herself the warmth in the stove probably meant Ed had visited recently before becoming too sick. Maybe he maintained the place without telling her. Maybe there was nothing strange happening at all. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered stubbornly in the back of her mind throughout the evening. By nightfall, rain hammered the roof hard enough to shake the entire structure. Eleanor sat wrapped in an old blanket beside the stove, drinking instant coffee heated over a portable camping burner she found in one of the cabinets. The river outside looked black beneath the storm clouds, moving slowly past the dock like something alive. She was just beginning to drift into exhausted sleep when footsteps echoed across the wooden planks outside. Heavy footsteps. Deliberate. Eleanor froze instantly. Another step. Then another. Somebody was approaching the door. Panic surged through her so fast, she nearly dropped the coffee cup. Her eyes darted around the room desperately until landing on a rusted fireplace poker leaning beside the stove. She grabbed it with trembling hands just as the doorknob rattled once, then slowly turned. The door creaked open. A tall man stepped inside carrying a lantern that illuminated rain dripping from his coat and gray beard. He stopped immediately upon seeing her standing there gripping the poker like a weapon. For several seconds neither of them moved. "You Whitaker?" the man finally asked carefully. Eleanor tightened her grip. "Who wants to know?" The stranger studied her face for a long moment before lowering the lantern slightly. "Name's Jonah Mercer," he answered. "I've been keeping an eye on this place for your husband." Eleanor did not lower the poker. "My husband's dead." "I know," Jonah said quietly. "He told me to expect you eventually." That sentence sent a cold chill through Eleanor stronger than the rain outside. Jonah looked to be in his early 60s, broad-shouldered despite age, with rough hands that suggested decades of hard physical work. There was something guarded about him, like a man used to speaking carefully. He removed his hat respectfully and glanced around the room before speaking again. "I was worried someone else might get here first." Eleanor stared at him in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jonah hesitated visibly. Then he closed the door behind him and set the lantern onto a nearby table. "Your husband was protecting something out here," he said. "Something people with money have been trying real hard to get their hands on." Eleanor almost laughed from sheer disbelief and exhaustion. "This place," she snapped bitterly, gesturing around the decaying boathouse. "Nobody wants this dump." Jonah's expression remained serious. "That's what they want you to believe." He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a county survey map across the table between them. Then he pointed toward a narrow section of riverbank directly beneath the boathouse property. Oil transport companies have been buying river access all across Blackwater for the last 6 years, he explained quietly. Most folks sold cheap because nobody told them what the land was really worth. But your husband figured it out. Eleanor stared at the map without understanding. Jonah tapped the riverbank again. This boathouse sits on the last untouched commercial access point for nearly 8 miles. Slowly, horrifyingly, realization began settling into place. The bank, she whispered. Jonah nodded grimly. They weren't just collecting a debt. They wanted you gone before you learned what you own. Rain thundered harder outside while Eleanor struggled to process everything she was hearing. Then Jonah delivered the sentence that truly frightened her. And if they know you found the deed, he said carefully, they'll come looking for the rest of it too. Eleanor frowned. The rest of it? Jonah met her eyes directly. Ed hid another document somewhere in this boathouse before he died. Without it, ownership can still be challenged in court. He paused briefly. And trust me, Mrs. Whitaker, somebody's already searching for it. Eleanor Whitaker had lived long enough to recognize the sound of trouble before it arrived completely. And by the third night inside the boathouse, she could feel it moving closer through the quiet, like an approaching storm rolling unseen across dark water. She barely slept anymore. Every creak of old wood, every gust of wind rattling the windows, every distant engine somewhere beyond the trees kept her staring into darkness with her heart pounding harder than it had in years. Jonah Mercer stayed nearby after warning her about the missing document, sometimes disappearing for hours before returning with groceries, firewood, or scraps of information gathered from town. And the more he spoke, the more Eleanor realized her husband had carried secrets far heavier than unpaid bills during the final years of his life. According to Jonah, developers working for shell companies had spent years quietly buying riverfront property all across Blackwater County, paying desperate landowners quick cash before anyone understood that a massive oil transport expansion was being planned through the region. Most people sold cheaply because they thought the river was dying anyway. Ed Whitaker had been one of the only owners stubborn enough to refuse every offer. Why didn't he tell me any of this? Eleanor asked one evening while rain tapped softly against the roof and Jonah repaired a broken lantern at the table. Jonah kept his eyes lowered. Probably same reason he hid the foreclosure from you, he answered quietly. He thought he still had time to fix things himself. That answer hurt worse than anger would have. Eleanor spent half the night afterward sitting alone on the dock wrapped in a blanket staring at black water, sliding endlessly beneath moonlight, trying to understand how the man she loved for 52 years could protect her and isolate her at the same time. She remembered all the nights Ed stayed out late, fishing, during the past few years. All the tense silences whenever certain businessmen appeared around town. All the unopened letters he shoved into drawers when he thought she was not looking. He had been fighting something alone while pretending life remained normal right until the end. 2 days later, the fighting reached her directly. It happened just after midnight. Eleanor woke suddenly to the violent sound of breaking glass. Before she could even sit upright, footsteps thundered across the boathouse floor below her tiny loft sleeping area. Flashlights sliced through darkness. Male voices whispered urgently, "Search everything." Panic hit her so fast, she nearly froze completely. Then instinct took over. She slipped silently from the cot and crawled toward the loft opening just enough to peer downward between the wooden rails. 3 men dressed in dark rain jackets moved through the boathouse, overturning crates and yanking open cabinets with brutal efficiency. Not thieves. Searchers. One of them smashed another window with a crowbar, while another kicked apart loose floorboards near the stove. "It has to be here," somebody hissed angrily. Eleanor's breathing became shallow and painful. Then suddenly a deafening shotgun blast exploded outside. The men jerked upright instantly. "Move!" a voice roared from the dock. "Jonah!" Chaos erupted below. Flashlights swung wildly as the intruders rushed toward the door. Another shotgun blast echoed through the night. This one clearly fired into the air, followed by Jonah shouting again. Within seconds, the men disappeared into darkness beyond the trees while Eleanor remained frozen in the loft, trembling uncontrollably. Jonah burst inside moments later carrying the shotgun and breathing hard. "You all right?" he barked. Eleanor nodded shakily, though she clearly was not. Rain poured through the shattered windows, while both of them listened to the fading sound of engines somewhere down the road. Jonah lowered the weapon slowly. Now you understand, he said grimly. These people aren't bluffing. But something had changed inside Eleanor. During those terrifying minutes hiding above the boathouse floor listening to strangers tear through her husband's final secret, fear was still there, yes, but beneath it another emotion had begun growing stronger. Anger. Deep, sharp anger unlike anything she had felt in decades. They buried her husband, took her home, tried to scare her out of the last thing he left behind. And now strangers were smashing through windows hunting secrets in the middle of the night, like she was already dead and buried too. By sunrise, Eleanor no longer looked frightened. She looked determined. We find the document first, she told Jonah, while sweeping broken glass into piles near the doorway. Jonah studied her carefully for a moment, then nodded once. They searched for 2 straight days. Every crate, every beam, every loose plank. Eleanor climbed through dusty storage lofts and crawled beneath the collapsing dock despite aching knees and swollen hands. They found old photographs, fishing licenses dating back 40 years, even forgotten whiskey bottles hidden beneath tarps, but no legal document. By the second evening, exhaustion settled over both of them like wet cement. Maybe they already got it, Jonah muttered quietly. Eleanor shook her head immediately. No, she could feel it somehow. Ed had hidden it carefully. Deliberately. Then, sometime after midnight while lying awake listening to river water strike the dock supports below, Eleanor remembered something her husband once said years earlier during a fishing trip after Daniel nearly dropped his pocket knife into the river. The river keeps secrets better than people do. Her eyes opened instantly. By dawn she was outside with a flashlight and crowbar despite Jonah insisting she wait until daylight strengthened. The old dock groaned dangerously beneath them as they moved toward the far end, where several warped planks sagged lower than the others. Eleanor crouched slowly, ignoring pain shooting through her knees, and aimed the flashlight beneath the dock supports. There, half hidden below the waterline, a rusted metal lockbox chained beneath the planks. Jonah stared down in disbelief. Son of a bitch, he whispered. 20 minutes later they dragged the dripping box inside and forced it open using a hammer and screwdriver. Eleanor's hands trembled harder with every second. Inside rested several sealed documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth beside a single handwritten envelope bearing her name. For a moment she could not breathe at all. She opened the letter first. Ellie, it began in Ed's familiar uneven handwriting. Asterisk if you're reading this, then things went bad faster than I hoped. I'm sorry for leaving this mess behind you. Truth is, I thought I could outlast them long enough to protect both the house and the river. I was wrong about that, but I wasn't wrong about you. Don't trust the bank. Don't trust anyone offering fast deals. This land is worth more than they'll ever admit, and they know it. Make them pay honestly for every inch they tried stealing from us. And one more thing, Ellie. I never stopped loving you. Not one single day. Asterisk Eleanor pressed the letter against her chest and finally cried harder than she had even at the funeral. Not small quiet tears either. Full body sobs that shook decades of buried exhaustion loose all at once, while Jonah silently stepped outside to give her privacy. The remaining documents proved everything. Original mineral access rights, commercial river easements, ownership transfers signed decades earlier, and county survey maps showing the boathouse property controlled the most valuable undeveloped transport point left on Blackwater River. Within a week, lawyers began calling constantly. Then company representatives arrived offering polite smiles and increasingly enormous amounts of money. The same bank that evicted her suddenly spoke to Eleanor Whitaker with nervous respect. One executive even drove personally to the boathouse, trying to negotiate before lawsuits exposed what had happened behind closed doors. Eleanor listened calmly while sitting at the same table where strangers once searched through her belongings with flashlights. When he finished speaking, she slid the foreclosure notice back across the table toward him. Funny thing about old people, she said quietly. Everybody thinks we're too tired to fight back. In the end, the settlement amount shocked the entire county. Millions for river access rights alone. Enough money to buy back her old house 10 times over. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But the most surprising part came afterward. Eleanor refused to sell the boathouse itself. Developers got the surrounding land. The river access deal moved forward. But the old structure beside Blackwater stayed exactly where it belonged. Over the next year, workers rebuilt the dock, restored the building, repaired the roof, and painted the weathered walls blue again, just like they had looked decades earlier. Travelers passing through town began stopping there for coffee and pie. Fishermen rented small boats along the riverbank. Locals started calling the place Ellie's Landing. And every evening, just before sunset, Eleanor sat quietly on the rebuilt porch overlooking the river with Ed's final letter folded carefully inside her sweater pocket. No longer feeling like the widow who lost everything during the worst week of her life, but the woman who survived long enough to discover that her husband's final gift was never really about money at all. It was about making sure the world could never erase her after he was gone.